Hello, welcome to the final event of the first ever Brighteye Edtech Startup Festival. To those for whom it is your first event, a very warm welcome. I'm Wirz, Brighteye's head of research. For those of you that aren't familiar with our work, Brighteye is the most active edtech focused fund in Europe, with interest spanning the sector from the early years to lifelong learning and everything in between. We partner with companies in their early stages, supporting them in pre-seed, seed, and Series A rounds, with both the investment and thematic support wherever we can be most helpful. And this work has really shaped the program that we're having this week with the festival and the themes that we've covered to date. And as I've mentioned several times now, this is our final event. It promises to be a fantastic session, an Ask Me Anything session with investors and an accelerator. And we're really pleased to be able to hand over to Freya Pratty-Williams from Sifted to moderate the discussion ahead. So over to you, Freya, and thanks again, everyone, for joining.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, very happy to be here. As we said, I'm Freya, I'm a reporter at Sifted, and we have three great panelists lined up for you today. I'll go to each of you for a very brief introduction, if that's okay. Ian, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, everybody. This is Ian Chiu. I'm one of the managing directors at Owl Ventures. We're a global edtech firm. We partner with a lot of different other funds in investing in the edtech space as well. So I'm delighted to be here. As a firm, just as a quick overview, we are the largest global venture fund focused on edtech and invest all around the world. We have about 70 portfolio companies and manage a little bit over $2 billion across our fund. So thank you for having me.
And Ben?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Wirz. I'm a partner with Brighteye. Reese, I think, gave a good overview of what Brighteye is at the outset, so I won't belabor it, but we're a European edtech-focused venture capital fund, and we've been around since 2017. So excited to dive into these questions.
Cool, great. And then Temi?
Hello, everyone. My name is Tamil Datta. I am the Startup VC Partnerships Lead at Google for Startups. And specifically, I am on the investment committee and selection team for the Black Founders Fund, which is where Google has invested how much in total? About 6 million in total across Europe, non-equity cash into Black-led tech startups. We have 70 in our portfolio so far.
It's really cool. And I'm happy, I think we have experience from across the fundraising stages, so I think that's going to be really useful. And as we've said, this is going to be an hour-long session, so I'll ask some questions for roughly the first half, and then I really want questions from the audience for the second half of that. You can ask questions, you can type them in the chat, or you can put your hand up as well. And I want it to be as interactive as possible, so please think of some really good questions as we're going through. And let's open on a really positive note. I want to know from each of you which kind of subsectors or trends or particular companies even you're going to track across the next, say, 6 months to a year and you think are really, really exciting. Ben, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So I think there are three sort of, subsets of edtech that I would highlight. One, just given the current moment, I'm really excited about companies that save educational institutions money, because I think we're in a moment where that there's a downturn coming, if not already present, in the markets that we're most active in Europe and the US. And so I think companies that have sort of an ability to save educational institutions money, either directly because they provide a service at a cheaper price, or indirectly because they help preserve revenue through increasing student engagement or whatever it is, are companies that we're definitely excited about, even though it's a fairly, I would say, not necessarily the sexiest theme, but that's definitely something that we pay attention to. I think something that's probably more top of mind in the press is Web3, which, to be honest, I was very skeptical of, and I still am somewhat skeptical of. I think education honestly hasn't gotten Web2 right yet, so Web3 might be a step too far in most domains. But I do think, particularly applied to credentials, we've seen some interesting approaches there, and I would expect that to continue. So I think that's something we pay attention to. And then I guess the last thing that we look at is companies that are helping to address the skills gap, but in the sectors where we see the most demand. So that includes teaching, actually includes nursing, but it also includes obviously the tech sector, where there continues to be huge demand. And we think that demand will continue to be strong even despite an economic downturn. So those are things that we're excited about.
Cool. I want to get on to some questions specifically about the downturn and what founders should be doing in those conditions later. Temi, what are you excited about in the sector at the moment? And what's your Web3 thoughts, if I'm kind of interested in that in particular?
Well, I'll start with my thoughts on Web3. I think there's a lot of faff out there right now, and no one really understands what it's going to look like, how we integrate everybody's ideas into what this Web3 looks like. However, there is something there. It will eventually turn into something that is useful. So I think it's just kind of a waiting game, sussing out what's actually of value and adding value to society, whether it's workforce, education, healthcare, whatever. So that it will be significant, as in what it adds, but just where it's going to bring the real value, I'm not just completely sure yet. For education, I think the areas that really interest me is looking at the early years education, but outside of the traditional schooling kind of methods that we see that is normal for us now. This is mainly because I see a shift in society, especially as millennials and Gen Zs become parents. Their idea of the education system and what that looks like and how valuable it actually is, I think, is very much shifting. You just need to be on TikTok to see that they don't necessarily value schooling and university the same way that our parents, grandparents would have. So tech startups that are helping parents, whether it's homeschooling, home education, whatever, get more involved in that. That's really interesting. Also, similar to what Ben, kind of echoing what Ben said about the workforce upskilling. I think, especially with remote working, hybrid working, employees need to work harder to make sure that their employees are staying engaged, upskilling, and actually going to continue adding value to their organizations. And when they're not on premise, it's a bit more difficult. So whatever businesses are working in those areas, I think are absolutely fantastic. I will just name drop a few just because they're in my portfolio, so why not? But MoonHub is a great example. They are a Series A company. They're about to be Series A company. Series A company now. And they focus on virtual reality training for the workforce. So they increase engagement, increase the appetite for your workforce to continue learning through virtual reality. And then we also have Framework that looks at educating the employees within startups, which is also brilliant. I think she's actually spoken on one of your panels, actually. So that's also one to look out for. I'll leave it there.
Oh, thank you. No, that's really interesting. And Ian, what are you kind of tracking or taking note of in the next few months?
Yeah, it seems like actually one that I was thinking of is exactly the same as Ben and Temi as well, which is just skilling, at all levels. And I really think that there's a couple of different flavors of this. I think, as the economy slows in certain areas of the world, obviously, we have employees that need to figure out how to reskill and how to, reapply or apply, into new roles. I think there are certain industries, particular vocational skills industries as well, where, there's a wide group of demographic, changes that are happening, and a wide group of folks that are, retiring, out of certain vocations. And so, reskilling and skilling new labor into those end markets, I think, is particularly important. And then also, I'd say that, skilling sort of broadly, involves both, asynchronous, synchronous, as well as understanding, what to focus on as well. So, the assessment side, of the skilling equation, I think, is particularly important.
Okay.
To Temi's point, like we also have a portfolio company in the assessment area called Workera that is focused on essentially that skills assessment, and then also a few companies on the VR side, also from the skilling standpoint. And then the last thing I would just say is, as generally COVID restrictions start to ease a bit, we're sort of moving into this new normal, so to speak. There's more and more, I think, international student flow again. And so I think that's also a really interesting area that we're focused on.
Yeah, that's interesting, the international students point. And then I want to go to each of you again with this question, because as we said, you're all at different stages of a startup's fundraising journey. So I think it's important to hear from all of you. But what are you looking for when a startup either comes to your accelerator or your fund? And critically, how much weight are you all putting on the importance of the product versus the founding team? Perhaps should we start at Temi, because you're kind of the earliest stage in the startup's life?
Yeah, sure. Just for context, the accelerator and investment that we're doing is usually looking at startups that are pre-seed and seed stage, so pretty early. And I think it's pretty much, when it's an accelerator, pretty much the same as what your early stage investor is looking at also, which is your vision, your team, and kind of your essentially your product. Do we believe in the problem you're solving and your solution? I think the team and the team is equally as important as your product, because do we believe that you are uniquely positioned and the right person to drive the business forward? So one thing I just asked all early stage founders to do is not to sell short the slides in your deck that are talking about the team and showing us where you guys have come from, how you've met, what you're doing, like what your unique values are you're bringing to the team. I think it's very important, because we're backing you rather than backing anything else at that point.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Ben, when it gets to you, is that balance shifting, or are you still kind of focused largely on the team?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, look, unfortunately, the short answer is it depends, which I wish you could just say, here's what we do, and then everybody would know what box they fall into. But I think there is always this balance between, the quality of the team, the attractiveness of the market / opportunity, and then the traction that you actually have in the business itself. And I guess the way I think about it, I'm not sure if this is helpful for founders, but it's certainly helpful for me as a heuristic, is to some degree, the more differentiated your product / technology, the more risk we're willing to take, right? And so if you add, the example I always give is, if you had the technology from the Matrix where you could download skills directly into people's brains, right? If you had one person who had never done anything else, but they had that technology, was locked down, and they had no customers and nothing else, we would certainly be quite interested, and I think people would be throwing money at them, left and right, because this is differentiated sort of technology that doesn't exist in the marketplace, right? If you have, if you're doing sort of online math training, even if it's a different approach to it, there's a ton of online math training out there, right? That you're competing against, and so the amount of, and even if you have the greatest team in the world, who is backing it, you need a lot more traction, right? Like there has to be a lot more that you can actually show in terms of the way people are behaving, and before we would get interested in it, just because it's a competitive market, and it's really hard to actually differentiate yourself there. So anyway, it's sort of unfortunately it's a bit of a spectrum, but that's we weight it differently depending on how differentiated your approach is.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And then Ian, when we get to later stages, what are you looking for?
Yeah, and I think for us, actually, we're stage agnostic, stage flexible, and so we are doing sort of seed all the way through growth stage. And so I think that what Ben articulates, is spot on. I'd love to have the Matrix download of skills, by the way, myself. When we look at early stage seed, we're focused on founder, vision, market, and really, so is there something there that jumps out as compelling about the background or what they're tackling? As you get into A, B plus type of rounds, really we start to think about, product efficacy, sort of the evidence of that product market fit, the growing team, like who have you been able to attract, to your vision and to your team. And then also early, monetization as well. We start to see that certainly at those stages. And again, like this is a pretty broad swath, strokes. I mean, every single company is going to be different and unique. And then as you get into some of the growth stage rounds, at that point, we're really focusing in on, how are you scaling that revenue? What are the unit economics as you scale? Are you adding in, if you're focusing on enterprises, are you building up that sales force appropriately? Or if you're focused on consumer, what does your customer acquisition equation look like? And, of course, at that point, at every level, you're always focused as well on team. and then competitive dynamics also. But I think the sort of focal point of some of the conversations certainly evolves, as the company, gets different stages for sure.
Okay. And I'm imagining that on the call we'll have quite a lot of founders who are thinking about and probably wanting some kind of actionable insights about how to approach investors. So I thought we would go for some very practical advice. Ben, perhaps first, what's your top tip on a pitch, and what do you like to see? What would you advise founders to do?
Yeah, I mean, mine is fairly basic, but I think it's really important to articulate what is it about the way that users are behaving, that tells you that you're onto something, basically, right? And that changes a bit depending on how advanced you are, but at the very early stage, it usually looks just like user retention. The amount of time they're spending in the product, or the repetitiveness of their behavior. Later on, it looks like more like net dollar retention. So the fact that you having 150% or versus net dollar retention year over year, which would be an incredible statistic, right, for a B2B startup. So if you can just articulate what it is that users are, the way the user is behaving, that lets you know that you're onto something, and then the bonus is and how that compares to other startups. So if you're like day 30 retention is 90%, and typically edtech game startups see 50% day 30 retention, then that's even better, right? Because you can show. But I think for the first order, just focus on behavior that's most effective.
Mm-hmm. And Temi, what about for founders wanting to approach an accelerator? What do you want to see from them? What's some kind of actionable thing that people could be doing better?
I think it's similar. It's just kind of articulating your story well, your problem, your solution. It's as simple as that. And make sure you communicate how you would benefit from being selected and being a cohort member on that accelerator. You'll be surprised as how many people just can't articulate that. Be detailed as to what you want to get out. Whether it's with us at Google, we have machine learning experts, data scientists, marketing specialists. If you can come and tell me the 5 people you want to speak to from Google and be like, yeah, because you have access to these people, I want to be on this accelerator, that's a bonus point. And that makes me think that you're going to be valuable to us and we could be valuable to you.
Mm-hmm. And Ian, I get this, people talk to me about this a lot when I talk to founders. They're always saying, how do we write a good intro email to a VC? And I obviously don't know, so I want to ask you, what do you like to see in an intro?
Yeah, I think that it can all take lots of different forms, but I think the most important thing from an intro email is to make it digestible. Everybody is swimming in inboxes trying to get to inbox 0 at some level, never works. But just make it digestible, punchy, hit the highlights of the business, why it's a particularly good fit for that VC. If it's Brighteye, if it's Owl, whomever, if it's Google, right? And I would also say that if there are any mutual connections that you have with the person that you're emailing, always great to highlight that as well, because that just makes it that much closer in terms of familiarity.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add, sorry, as a really practical thing that I tell our portfolio companies to do all the time when approaching investors is simply create a list of priority investors that you want to speak to, who are like your top favorites, all the way down to number 50, who's like, nice to talk to, but not that interested because they can't add much value. Just flip the list around and start your conversations with people at the bottom of your priority list. So by the time you've had all those conversations and you're talking to your number 1, top number 5, you've covered all the questions, you've answered all the potential questions that your number 1 to 5 will be asking you. So you're really ballsy with your pitch. You know what's coming, you know what to cover. Just makes everything a lot easier. Practice makes improvement. So please, that's a practical advice.
I haven't heard that before. That's interesting. And then I know we mentioned in the intros the kind of macroeconomic conditions and the sort of shakier conditions for tech at the moment. Ian, what are your forecasts for EdTech in particular? Perhaps you can take a global stance on it, and then we can drill down into Europe.
Yeah, I think that the last couple of years have been obviously very unique, and so what we saw was a really sort of just absolute torrid pace of need and adoption and usage, across EdTech. And so, that, again, as we sort of settle into a bit of a new normal, it's certainly going to slow down a little bit. But, when I say slow down, it's not that it's going to slow down and reverse course. It's really that, we're clearly not going to keep the same pace, as we did the last couple of years, simply because everybody, especially for that first year, was very much, in remote. To put that in context, though, and what I would say is taking a step back, a couple of things happened. I think the underlying secular trends that we're thinking about, in EdTech, that's all very much in place. And so, what happened in the last couple of years in our minds simply highlighted the importance of and need of EdTech, and also brought it into the mainstream, right? It was really catalytic in that sense. And, there's always sort of this activation energy, like if it happens over 10 years, maybe it's just sort of, too slow. But like in this case, I think it really brought everything to the fore. And so I think there's a lot of entrepreneurship and innovation, as a result, because it wasn't perfect. There's a lot of gaps, I think, that were revealed. And, people now, as they sort of think about, where should I focus my energies? A lot of folks, we find are drawn to EdTech. And so last thing I'll say is it's actually a fantastic time, to start a business, in the sense that there's a lot of talent, in the market right now. I would say that in the last, compared to the last couple of years, far easier to bring talent aboard now than 1 or 2 years ago. Just the competitive dynamic for that aspect of company building, I think is really, really well suited for the time. And so as an entrepreneur, sort of thinking about big problems, this is a wonderful time to start.
Okay, that's good. I like a positive outlook on it. That's good. Ben, what do you think about Europe's particular situation at the moment?
Yeah, I'm not sure that Europe is honestly too different from what Ina's describing globally. I think probably vis-a-vis the US, I think the thing that's probably the most different is schools, and to a lesser extent universities, were had much lower digital penetration, digital usage in Europe prior to COVID than in the US. And so actually I expect school adoption of technology to continue to grow at a fairly decent clip in Europe, because there's so much catching up to do. And anecdotally, from companies that we've invested in and companies that we've talked to, the behaviors there aren't going anywhere. I think the rate of the sort of let's throw all the tender processes out the window and just get what we need, which is what happened during COVID, that's gone. So you have to still go through a more formal process than you did before. But I think the demand from traditional institutions is quite strong, and there's still a bit of catching up to do. But I think in terms of consumer behavior, you'll still see kind of quite a bifurcation in terms of areas where the labor market is still quite hot, and you'll see a lot of activity both from consumers and from companies building to address the needs of those consumers. And then you'll see kind of larger swaths of the economy where there's not as much dynamism, and there's still going to be kind of a lack of solutions, I think, just because there's not enough sort of demand there. But yeah, I don't know. I think the short answer is I think there's still plenty of opportunities. There will certainly be a slowdown overall. There has already been a slowdown overall in terms of the pace of venture investing. That's probably, honestly, good for everybody, because it got a little too big, too fast, I would say. But there's plenty of opportunity for funding is continuing to happen, and there's also plenty of opportunity to build new companies. So that's great.
Okay, great. And Temi, how do you think early stage founders should be reacting to these conditions we're seeing? What should they be changing or planning for?
I think that as much as you're getting these scary emails from like the tier 1 VCs and accelerators saying, there's people are not investing anymore or don't prioritize growth over profitability, and it seems quite daunting. I think the simple thing is that when you're at early stage, nothing's really changed. You're still meant to be building great products and actually proving your traction and that you have customers. And that should have been like a no-so from before, but it's just that we were clouded by, you know, people raising ridiculous amounts and whatever, and, you know, the kind of the climate we were in. So I don't think anything changes at that point. Keep building, keep your head down, keep talking to investors. What's happening right now is that people are almost fearful of starting conversations because of the fear that there's no money out there or nobody's investing. The good investors are still investing. So keep having the conversations, because a lot of people are pulling back on their conversations. So make sure you're still having yours. Also, not all money is good money. So don't cheapen your cap table just for the sake of raising, you know, your rounds. That can really bite you in the bum a couple series up the line, and you don't want that headache. So make sure you're including people who actually add value to your cap table. And my last point on it is also, it takes as much effort to raise 500k as it does 10 million really. You're still having the same conversations, talking to the same amount of investors, trying to sell the same story. So really evaluate how much you actually need for your runway for the next, to see you through for the next 18 months. Be fair, don't be greedy, but be fair as to what you need. And don't feel like you need to reduce that solely for the basis of thinking it's going to be easier to raise. I don't think that will be helpful for you in the long run.
Okay, that's good advice. And then question to Ian and Ben. What are you advising portfolio companies to do at the moment? Whoever wants to go first. Ian, maybe. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, happy to. You know, really in this environment, I mean, you know, it's a focus on continue to grow, but grow efficiently, right? And so it's, I think there was a lot of growth at all costs mentality in the last few years. And, you know, part of that was, you know, a function of the capital market environment. Part of that was also, particularly within Edtech, there was a moment in time, again, where, you know, the adoption and interest and appetite for products and solution was, you know, went from 0 to 100, you know, at all, well, not 0, but, you know, went accelerated meaningfully. And so I think right now, really, it's really kind of thinking about, you know, what are your, you know, goals over the next year, 2 years? What is your runway, you know, based on the cash that you have? How do you sort of think about, you know, that efficient growth, focusing in on the unit economics, and then, you know, really sort of mapping backwards from, you know, when you think about, again, depending on what stage you're at, when you're thinking about what that next fundraise time period is going to be and what do you want to look like, and then build towards that. And I think, you know, that's frankly advice that we always give, but I think particularly in this moment in time, you know, right now that we find ourselves in, it's even more, I think, important, you know, for folks to have a focus on that.
Mm-hmm. Ben, what's Brighteye telling people to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's not too dissimilar, I would say. I think if you didn't know what a burn multiple was before, I think you should probably go look it up and try to figure out. And it's really just a way of measuring the amount of revenue you're generating versus the cash you're spending, basically. And I think, honestly, to be fair, a lot of investors were not paying attention to that in 2020 and 2021. It was really about growth at all costs. I mean, from a more practical perspective, you know, the two things that we're seeing in terms of funding trends, one is, you know, there are rounds that are getting done, but it's taking way longer than it did before. And so if, you know, before the conventional wisdom was you could afford to wait until 6 months before you were running out of cash and to really get, you know, kick off the fundraising, you know, 9 to 12 months is probably much more, and honestly, the best time to raise, which has always been the case, but it probably more salient now is when you actually don't need the cash, right? Like the rounds we've had 2 companies raise 10 to 12 million rounds in the last month. Both of them did not need the money, and I think one of the 2 was led by insiders, and it just was a result of good reporting from the company and saying, hey, you know, we're seeing expansion in this market, and you know, like there was no DAC, it was just basically existing investors, you know, so you can still get that kind of money, but you know, as the truism is, you know, the folks who least need the money have the easiest time getting it, and so if you can afford to, if you can plan to raise at a time when really you can afford to walk away from that money or don't really need the money. Mm-hmm. So, you know, those are the practical tips I would say, but it's a tougher market, but it's still possible.
Cool, great, thank you. So yeah, let's go to some questions from the audience. We had one earlier. Which stages of learning do you see the most investment opportunities for early stage startups? I don't know who wants to take that. Perhaps Temi, do you want to go for that?
Yes. What stages of learning do you see?
Yeah, so yeah.
As in, sorry, is that to mean what?
Which I take it to mean which age group do you think has the most potential for an early stage startup to go in and work on?
Oh,
or Ben,
so it's kind
of Ben or Ian jump in as well, whoever wants to take the question.
Yeah, I would say that for me, what I personally find really interesting is the really early years, from like, from 4, depending on what country you're in some parts of Europe, it's from 7 to kind of 13, where there's like an unschooling, I think they're calling it, or home education trend that's really brewing, and I just find very fascinating. And parents basically need the tools to be able to teach their children themselves. So I think that age range is very fascinating right now, because those are probably the best learners in society that we have when your child is that age. But I also think you have to think about the areas who actually have money, universities, higher education, who actually need the tools, better tools to digitize and to deliver better education. So the B2B element, I would say the higher years education is great.
Mm-hmm. Ian, what do you think? Which age group is most interesting at the moment for that?
Honestly, I think I would flip it around a little bit, because there's always going to be plenty of opportunities across all age groups. We're investing from early childhood all the way through adult. And so I really would sort of flip it around and say that it's what the individual, the entrepreneur is sort of passionate about and also identifies a big problem in. And that's the best place, as opposed to sort of thinking about, well, where's the investment dollars going across? Because honestly, we see companies at every single age group right now. And the ones that stand out and get funded are the ones that have a unique sort of founder background that fits the big problem that they're looking to solve. And that's where I would start.
Okay, interesting. And we had another question, perhaps Ben, you can take this one. How much potential is there in digital online teaching platforms for schools? I guess we're thinking like mainstream schooling.
So I'm going to interpret the question, and whoever wrote the question can tell me if I'm misinterpreting what they're asking. But if the question is, how much room is there to deliver sort of online content in physical schools, then that's a trend that we're seeing play out, that has played out a fair amount in the US, where there are particularly around subject matters where it's hard to get teachers. So AP chemistry, if they don't have an AP chemistry teacher, that kind of thing has been going on for quite some time. I think there's more. There's more of a movement in the U.S. towards just purely online education for purely online public education that exists anywhere outside the U.S. And so that's quite interesting. And there are companies that are fairly sizable at this point that are delivering public school online only education, which is interesting, either as a registered public school or as a registered charter school that people can kind of opt into. So the short answer is it's there, it's growing. If you look at as a business opportunity, it's quite interesting. Do I think it's going to be a big part of the way that society educates children? I don't think so, just because there's a huge sort of caretaking function that physical schools provide, beyond the education. I think when during COVID, people discovered just how much just what the balance was between caretaking and education, when you have to try to do both as the parent who's sitting behind your child. And so it strikes me as highly unlikely that would go away, in a major way. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Temi or Ian, do you agree on that?
Yeah, I think very valid point there.
Cool, great. But any other questions in the audience, please put them in the chat. I want to get through as many as I can from you guys, so please put some more in the chat. I wanted to ask Ian, because this is like at Sifted, we cover Europe, and so founders are often asking questions on when they should go to the US or how they should do it and at what stage. Perhaps you have some thoughts on that. Yeah,
it's a good question. I think that in terms of kind of coming to the US, it's also a question of what is the market availability and what is the market in front of the company in Europe, presuming that they're coming out of Europe. And so demonstrating that strong traction, again, the product and product market fit, I think in sort of the local market, obviously, is going to be far easier than trying to skip over the pond and do the same thing. So I think it's really a function of both the team capability, familiarity, and then also the product. I mean, we do have a portfolio company that very much is active in the US, but based in Europe, a company called Labster. They do essentially the sort of simulation teaching for labs, for schools and for students, and also now increasingly for enterprise. They're based in Denmark, but they have operations in Boston, and big sort of amount of their customer base is actually in the US. So it's a big market. I would just say, don't go before you're ready. And at the same time, try to explore it a little bit ahead of the time that you're thinking about going, because it'll probably take a little bit longer than you anticipate. And I think a big part of making that happen also is finding the right team or team members that are familiar and have experience in those markets, to be able to navigate that. So.
Ben, what do you advise companies at Brighteye, not necessarily America, but just like expansion in general? Any kind of tips on that strategy?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's a little bit of it depends. I think the we have actually some great literature on the website around internationalization and how to think about internationalization. So I encourage people to check that out. I think the general heuristic is, I guess two things. One is, if you're coming from the smaller market you're starting in, the sooner you're internationalizing, right? And just by virtue, so we have one company, for example, that's in Lithuania. They're killing it in Lithuania, but that it doesn't necessarily get you very far in the venture scope of things, right? So they've had to think about internationalization from day one. Whereas if you start in Germany or France or one of these other markets, you can delay that decision a bit, and that can it can help you and hurt you. It gives you a lot more sort of momentum once you start internationalizing, but it also suspends the day where you have to actually think about what that product might look like elsewhere. Which sometimes if you do that earlier, it's more helpful. The other heuristic is just that to some degree, whether you're trying to expand into a smaller market or a bigger market, the effort is the same. There is certainly a degree of competitiveness that you have to factor into, and so the U.S. market is by far the most competitive market, right? So it's not that I think every market should jump from Lithuania to the U.S., but there is certainly an effort that goes into it, and if you're certainly you should think about trying to expand into a bigger market from wherever you started, and ideally by some order of magnitude, right? Because otherwise, the effort is kind of wasted. And so that's the other thing is to some degree, bigger markets don't necessarily require more capital to launch than smaller markets. What they do potentially require is higher cost of acquisition, right? Because the more competitive, the higher the cost, so that you have to balance those things.
Okay, we've had a question about GDPR and privacy. So I don't know if any of you guys are particularly kind of interested or clued up on that. But the question is, a while ago, platforms with extensive data sets that used to impact their valuation. Now with GDPR concerns, is that still true? I think I'm interpreting the question right, but Susan, tell me if I'm not. I guess it's if a startup is having to collect a lot of people data, is that going to have an impact on how an investor sees them? I don't know who wants to take that or who's got a particular view on that. I guess GDPR is a European specific.
Yeah, I was going to say, the short answer is I don't. Most of the deals that I saw that were impacted positively by having a lot of data, it was really about marketing, right? So if you look at the MIT, I can't remember the name of their open platform that got purchased by Chiu, but a lot of that was just about the number of users and reducing the cost of user acquisition for Chiu, right? So they bought it for 800 million, just basically because they had it wasn't revenue driven, it was just driven by the amount of users that they had, and so to some extent, if data leads to lower cost of acquisition or lower cost of AI development, if that's what the data is being used for, then it's going to be, I think the value is pretty solid, and I don't think GDPR impacts that very much. I guess, the place where GDPR might have an impact is if you had a bunch of data that for whatever reason you can't use anymore, or you can't mine anymore because of GDPR concerns, then in that case, obviously, the value of that company would be diminished, and that's more driven by revenue than whatever ancillary value they have. I don't know if that's helpful. That's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, I think that sounds up. Ian, do you have any thoughts on what data does to how an investor sees a company?
Yeah, I think it's really about the data around the business. To Ben's point, that's helpful. When we get into things like data privacy, I mean, it's really more that we want to be able to ensure that the company is not tripping any data privacy issues, frankly. And then, if it's about student data, then really I'm more interested in efficacy and outcomes. And it doesn't need to get into line by line detail on student data from that perspective, but really what is actually happening once students or learners are using your product, and then to Ben's point, the go-to-market motions and all the data around that.
We've had a question, perhaps Temi, you want to take this one. How excited are you about companies that take a model and in one market and replicate it into another? And what's the risk of doing that?
I don't hate it and I don't necessarily love it. If it's sometimes you see a gap in terms of they're doing it in Europe, they're not doing it in the US, so we're just going to start doing it, and that's great. And if that works, perfect. But I think it always seems very easy to say you're replicating something, but there's so many factors that mean that you're never going to really just replicate it, just like pick it up and copy and paste it over. So it kind of ties into this whole idea of expanding into other countries. It's not enough just to be able to switch your application or whatever you're doing into Spanish or a different language. There's so many factors around like really localizing it, especially if you're working with machine learning or AI. It's not enough just to change the language. You actually have to understand how cultural norms, religious norms, whatever norms change how consumers utilize your product in that new land. So I'm not mad at it, but I don't think it's as easy as people think it is, just to pick up an idea and copy and paste it somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And then we've had a question, how do the UK and Germany compare as a market for starting up a startup that's going to be successful? I don't know if any of you three are particularly want to make the case for either of them, or any thoughts on that?
I would just say just from a paperwork perspective, the UK is much easier. That's all I can say. I mean, Germany is a nightmare from just the like in terms of all sort of company registration functions, and I think you still have to be in person, or somebody that you represent still has to show up in person in order to get a closing done, which is quite Byzantine by today's standards. So yeah, that's the only thing. That's a major difference I would say between the UK and Germany.
Mm-hmm. Temi, do you fall down particularly on either side?
The UK is notoriously known for the especially London, the startup hub, the scene where loads of companies are being invested in, and there's lots of movement from investors. But Germany equally comes with its benefits in terms of talent, technical talent that you can access. So I mean, it's about you really and what you're building. So you can usually pick up a company and just change the jurisdiction. Oh gosh, I've lost my words now. But yeah, it doesn't really make much difference to me.
Nice. And then another question: what's your position on B2G business models? Ian, do you wanna go?
Yeah, I have to. I think B2G is an interesting angle to pursue. And again, it depends on the product. I mean, it's a very nuanced question to what you're actually delivering. But, we often see B2G alongside other models as well. So it's, probably the rare company that is entirely B2G oriented, but companies, we see a lot of different companies, I think, that come with a B2B approach. And then as part of that, there's a B2G sort of element or, slice of the business as well. Generally, I'd say, it's not the majority, but that it does certainly add, some texture to the business and opportunities that are particularly unique. So again, like with Labster, as an example, I mean, they're selling to universities, they're selling to companies, and then the Danish Ministry of Education also signed with them to deliver Labster to all high school students in Denmark. So that's sort of more the flavor that we see as opposed to like 100% kind of B2G company. So
okay,
I think that's
Ben, what are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually there's a huge opportunity there right now. My sense is in part because of the pandemic, like a lot of this is again purely anecdotal. So take everything that any investor tells you with a huge grain of salt if we don't actually do the work. But I think the behavior, a lot of the behavior that the pandemic sort of made necessary during in terms of digital delivery of services by government. Has actually endured throughout, and that includes schools, but it goes way beyond schools. It's digital training through housing associations, in the UK or whatever, and so that actually provides a fair amount of opportunity for startups. That being said, the hard part of B2G is it's often super slow sales cycles, and it's often quite binary in terms of landing these big contracts, and so B2G. I almost always, not always, but almost always is a kind of a stage 2, thing where you can maybe start out selling to schools if that's the smallest unit, or local councils if that's the smallest unit. Getting real big government contracts, just takes an inordinate amount of time, and the reputation required to win a big contract is sort of inimical to what startups do. So it's hard to follow.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and yes, we've got about 10 minutes left, so if anyone has a question they really want to ask, please put it in the chat. Perhaps we can, I know we started on what you are excited about and interested in the sector. Perhaps is there anything, I guess we touched on it with Web3, but anything that you're like, ugh, would never invest, hate it, it's not going to go anywhere, anything like that? Temi, anything that you're deeply skeptical of at the moment?
I think it's the ones that are very obvious right now, is that people are investing in at the height of the pandemic, which is like remote working type tools, which is, I mean, remote working is still going to go ahead, but just kind of the very big obvious tools that are kind of doing the same thing. I guess people were just replicating in different locations, and delivery services. How fast can you get your groceries to me? I mean, it's very obvious, but it's the things that are just not very interesting to me. I'm generally more interested in things that are actually either creating some type of new technology or changing the way we live our lives in some type of, in some type of market or whatever. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Ben or Ian, do you have any controversial opinions or anything?
I mean, hardware, we've had just terrible experiences with hardware, and so I think we wouldn't invest in hardware whether it's delivered through schools or directly to consumer. It's just too hard. It's not honestly necessarily a sign of the market. It's more just a sign of our competence. Although I think generally hardware does take up a lot more cash, and we're in a more cash conscious environment, so it makes it difficult for everybody. Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, yeah, I think the only other thing I would say that it's not that we would never do it, but I think most of what we see is just doesn't meet the bar is educational games. Educational games, I would love to invest in more educational games. Obviously, Roblox and Minecraft are two of the most valuable edtech companies that have ever been built, to some, arguably. But a lot of what we see around just, direct provision of games to kids are really struggling to sort of hit venture scale, even if they're interesting business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then we've had a question, perhaps Ian, you want to take this one? Or did you have a controversial opinion you wanted to?
No, go ahead. We can go to the next question. Nothing super controversial.
What's the top reason companies get turned away during due diligence? What do you see?
Gosh, I mean, it's a good question. On the top reasons, again, it depends on the stage. But if you sort of go back to what we were all talking about what we look for, I mean, I think it's really just just by the numbers, there are going to be more companies that we see than we obviously invest in. And so, it's really more about, do the companies that we're funding and the ones that we're talking to really, really hit on the sort of criteria or the things that we're evaluating at the time. And, we just have to have really high conviction around the investments that we make. And so I don't know that there's a quote unquote top reason. I think it's just more that the ones that we ultimately invest in are the ones that we really, really feel highly about. And oftentimes, there are, one or two things that don't quite hit the mark, for us. And that's sort of a reason for us to sort of just say, hey, look, like we'd love to kind of like at least keep track and evaluate and see over time, if this, say product market fit, if there's more evidence of that, or if there's, so yes, I don't have like a succinct answer because there's a lot of different reasons. I think it's more about, are you hitting sort of the key criteria that specific, fund is really evaluating. And almost to Temi's point, a lot of people, and to Ben's point, like everybody also has, their own sort of lens by which they're filtering / like investing and getting, what they're getting excited about. And so, just because one, fund sort of turns you away, I wouldn't take that as, a reason to, necessarily tinker. I mean, take the feedback in stride and, incorporate it if you feel like it resonates. But there are a lot of, investors out there that, take a different lens to investing, and it's really a function of finding the right fit at some level as well.
And off the back of that, we had a question which is saying, as a startup, when you put in an application, you often don't get feedback. What's the best way for a founder to try and get that feedback or work out what needs to be fixed? Would you say they should just ask you, or how should people negotiate that?
The most, honestly, the best, although obviously it's not always possible, but the best way to get honest feedback is if you were connected through a third party to the investor, to ask that third party to go get you honest feedback. And because there's a relationship there, usually that's the most transparent feedback. It may not be the nicest to hear, but you will get things of like, well, we just didn't believe the founder had enough experience in this domain to pull this off, and it's really competitive, which is not something you can necessarily say directly to the founder. You would say that you might tiptoe around it and say, hey, this is a competitive space, and so we just couldn't get comfortable. But if the deal is, hey, we just need somebody with more expertise, and that maybe you can take that advisement. But I think Ian is quite right that one investor's opinion is one investor's opinion, and so take that with a big grain of salt. If you get 10 investors' opinions and they're all saying the same thing, then you might, that's probably something you should take a little bit more, put a little bit more weight on. But.
Mm-hmm. Someone's asked, what's the panel's view on the future of traditional universities? Will they continue to exist in their current form? Who wants to jump in and answer that one? Temi, do you have thoughts on the future of the university?
I think there's too much money in these traditional universities for anyone to let them sink and drown just yet. It's pretty similar to a lot of banking systems. So I think they're going to have to innovate. So they will just what I think is just they will continue to exist, but just in some type of different form. They're going to be forced to innovate slightly.
Mm-hmm. Ian, what's your?
I mean, I think there's, the traditional universities, I would say are starting to partner with external organizations quite a bit. They, at least in the U.S., I mean, there certainly are small regional schools that, frankly, are starting to, either close down, as well, just kind of given the demographic shifts and reduced enrollment. But if you just kind of look at like what universities are doing, I mean, there's a lot of partnerships that they're doing, with external groups. There's a lot of technology that they're starting to incorporate as well. I mean, again, Labster is a good example of that. We have another portfolio company called class.com that's doing, essentially a learning platform on top of Zoom. That's getting a lot of good traction. So there is more and more, particularly again, the last couple of years, I think, shook up, the market and also perspectives. And I think people at the university level now are, much more amenable and open to sort of thinking about this, obviously, in this moment now, as opposed to, even 3 years ago. And so I think they will continue to evolve. And that being said, there will also be a lot of companies that, get started and have been started, frankly, around the university as well, meaning, they're providing and provisioning their own education and certificates and, credentialing, et cetera. And so I think just the ecosystem is going to be, much more heterogeneous than it was, prior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ben, what do you think on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In developed markets, Europe, US, I don't see a ton of change. I think, I think because there's enough. I mean, demand has kind of topped out in most of those markets, but it's there's still a ton of it. I think the places where they're likely to see a lot of changes is markets where there's just a huge gap between supply and demand, and that's Africa and Asia primarily. And so I think Nexford, which we're not investors in, but announced funding today, and they're delivering a degree for $3,000 or something like that, versus a credit degree for $3,000 versus $30,000. So I think and they're serving primarily Africa. I would expect to see more change there and more competitive models.
Mm-hmm. I want to keep talking about this. It's interesting. I realize we're hitting an hour though, so I should hand back to Wirz probably.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your time and valuable contributions, Temi, Ian and Ben, and of course Freya as well, of course, for moderating. I'm sure there'll have been some really helpful insights for people watching there, and hopefully for people in the future watching the recording of this. As you'll now know, that's a wrap on the Brighteye Edtech Startup Festival. We will hopefully do it again. It's been a really positive experience for us on our side, so we hope it has been for you as well. So thanks a lot for joining and for your engagement across the week, and wishing everyone a great and restful weekend. See you later.